So anyway, it turns out like this is the type of stuff our brain starts to do. Our brains are really good at filling in holes and imagining. It's actually what makes us really, really creative people and really innovative and able to do a lot of different things. But our brains fill gaps for us.
Technology is transforming how we think, how we lead, and how we win. From InterVision, this is Status Go, the show helping IT leaders move beyond the status quo, master their craft, and propel their IT vision.
Google the word bias and you will get over 2 billion results. That's billion with a B. We have heard a lot lately about gender bias, racial bias, and other biases. But the cold hard truth is that we all have biases. It's one of the ways we navigate this planet we live on and the lives we live. As a leader, understanding your biases can be the key to being a great leader rather than just a mediocre leader. Today on Status Go, we will focus on one category of bias a leader needs to be particularly aware of as they go about their day. Cognitive biases are the attempts of the brain to create shortcuts for information processing and decision making. Our guest is Mike Butler. Mike is the CTIO for First Merchants Bank in Muncie. In addition to being a self-proclaimed data geek, he is particularly interested in the effects of cognitive biases on innovation and creative problem solving. Mike, welcome to Status Go.
Thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here.
I am so excited about digging into this topic. I had the opportunity, for our listeners, I had the opportunity to hear Mike speak about this several weeks ago and jumped at the chance to get him on Status Go because I think what we're going to talk about today is really going to help you in your leadership journey, no matter where you are in that journey. But before we dive into that, Mike, I'd love for you to share a bit more about your background, your career journey, and how you came to be there at First Merchants.
Yeah, I actually, so I started as an intern actually at First Merchants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I interned, I had run a small computer repair business as a kid in college, making some extra money. And it turned out I was working on the guy who was the president of First Merchants Bank. I'd been working at his house. And he called me one day and he said, "Hey, what are you doing for the summer? Are you internship hunting?" I said, "Yeah, I'm starting. I've been looking." And he introduced me to a guy named Stefan, who's currently is our executive CIO. And he ended up hiring me as an intern. I cut my teeth basically working with Kofax and some document imaging platforms that summer, which was like the first stuff we were doing as a bank. Mm-hmm. And he asked me to stay on, and I said I jumped at the chance. And so I spent most of my career then at First Merchants actually building different departments and teams. I built a data engineering team, built a software development team, built a BI team. And it really created, I think a lot of when you want to grow into a more executive role, it really is about like the value stream that you can develop and bring. And I found that building those types of technical capabilities, specifically when it got into data, I really enjoyed, and the company really got a lot of value from it. So like we went through like the 2008, financial collapse. A lot of the work that my team was doing on data at that time was giving us visibility into loan portfolios and things that were happening that a lot of other banks didn't have at the time. So anyway, so it was a really cool journey. Got to cut my teeth that way. In 2014, my boss was promoted and the CTO job came available, and they offered that to me. So then I got to spend the last 7 years moving data centers, developing the cloud infrastructure, working on all kinds of stuff. And then last year, or about 2 years ago, as we started the digital transformation journey, I started working with the executive team and saying, "Hey, I want to do more in the innovation realm. I want to help solve more problems that are occurring other than some of the support challenges and things like that." And so got the opportunity to move into the Chief Technology Innovation Officer role, where I'm right now just working on some different digital initiatives and some different new strategies and new modern architectures and things like that. So it's been a really fun journey.
I love that title, Chief Technology and Innovation Officer.
Yeah.
That is cool. Well, Mike, What's the story, man? How did you get interested in cognitive bias and interested enough to dedicate a good chunk of your time to study, write, and even speak about cognitive bias?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Why is a technology guy interested in this? So it starts, I was really young. So my dad's a cognitive psychologist. And if you think about it, he needed experiments and subjects for those experiments, right? So what better than his kids? And
So
some
you
of
were a
that's
lab
true.
rat.
We were lab rats. I'm kidding. Right? So he actually did a lot of research at Ball State, and so he developed the first human factors lab, which a lot of like these days we would call that like UX, experience design, things like that. And so we would go to his labs. We'd help set up the computers, these big Apple IIe labs. You know, when I say big, it's like 5 computers or something like that. But this is the '80s, so
Yeah,
back in
then
the
it
'80s that was
yeah,
big.
yeah.
So we got to do that. I got exposed then to some of the research. So he's doing lots of kind of research on interfaces, like how people interact with test interfaces, stuff like that. And as my career evolved, and then as I got more into data, I got really interested in what was happening from an innovation perspective with data, what was happening from a leadership perspective, what was happening within data when we collect, information. Is there bias in the data? And the answer is yes. I have a blog post on that. We could talk about it at a different time. And so I started to get really interested in like, how do I help people unlock their careers? How do I help them unlock their leadership abilities? How do I actually deal with my issues on projects and things like that, or what are they? And so I would talk to my dad, and he had really different perspectives than what you might have from a management course or something like that. And so I started to get really interested in it, and so I finished my MBA in, I think that was 2011. Started working. I can't stop going to school, even if I don't finish a degree. I start degrees all the time and take half the classes and just get really interested in it. But that led me towards start to do cognitive bias research, because I was really interested in innovation and leadership, and I found that there's all these ties that inhibit our ability to do things, or that we just need to be aware of, because it's actually part of how our decision making processes work. So it's been pretty interesting to go through that and do a lot of research on that. And while I don't consider myself like an expert in it, I have learned a lot about it, and I like to share it with people when I have the opportunity.
Well, I think it's great. And I think it's great that you're here with us today to share this with IT leaders who are our listeners, because I think some of what we're going to talk about is applicable every single day in the life of someone in IT. And as I mentioned at the outset, I heard you speak recently, and I love the way you started with the visualization exercise. You led the audience through this, and I'm wondering if you're game to try to do that with our listeners. Maybe we have them close their eyes and imagine the day.
Yeah.
But walk us through that exercise.
Well, I think you spoke of that a bit too, and you did one, and you're actually better at it. I will attempt to be as good at you, so we'll try it here. All right. So close your eyes and get ready. So let's just visualize some of this. So you've been appointed the head of IT for an up and coming company. You show up to work, and you have a lot of work to do that day. You got to finish contract negotiations. You have several issues you need to investigate. You need to meet a new team member named Taylor that's on your network team. As you walk into the office, you're greeted by Sam. Sam says, "Hey, that $1 million new SAN is in, and we're going to go take a look at it if you want to see. It's going to solve all our storage problems." You think your team told you it was 30 days to implement, so you've got some time to look later. The vendor said 90 days to implement, but if you push the team, you can do it in 30 days, because the executive team is expecting some big wins in your first few months in this role. Before you get pulled into that, though, you need to finish contract negotiations. You review the numbers. They don't seem that bad. It's time to make a deal. You ink the deal. You send it off to the account rep. Next, you call your managers in for a discussion on the hiring market. You've noticed that open positions are taking longer to fill. You're convinced the issue is that the HR pay structure isn't what you need to fill the roles. You ask your manager if that's what they think, and they confirm it. You have a whole team that you want to tell HR that they think you've identified the issue, and here's what we need to do. Next, you head down to the meeting with Taylor before tackling some more issues. You talk to Taylor for 30 minutes. You both like all kinds of the same stuff. You're basically the same person. You're convinced that Taylor is going to be a great employee. You head off for the next gauntlet of meetings for the rest of the day, satisfied you're going to make a difference. So the stuff that happened in there, Jeff, I'm sure you picked up on some of it. You've heard some of this before. But your brain did a bunch of stuff if you were imagining that. From trying to make shortcuts, trying to figure out who these people are. But like one was, what's the gender of Sam and Taylor? Those are pretty, generic names. Those could be male or female. Another is like, how much was in that contract? So we talked about the $1 million SAN earlier, and we'll talk about this in a second, but there's an anchoring effect that occurs when you hear a number and then you immediately go look at another number. But was it $1 million? And you're like, yeah, we just spent $1 million. We're okay. Another one's like, did you get any feedback on those theories, or did you everyone just started to agree with you, so you went with it? And we like that when people agree with us.
Yep.
Another's like, is HR really the problem? What if your managers haven't been interviewing because they're busy? Or another is like, why is Taylor a good employee? Just because you like the same things? Does that make sense? So anyway, it turns out like this is the type of stuff our brain starts to do. Our brains are really good at filling in holes and imagining. It's actually what makes us really, really creative people and really innovative and able to do a lot of different things. But our brains fill gaps for us. Yeah.
And it's those shortcuts that sometimes, we think, well, I'm an intuitive thinker, decision maker. I react by my gut, and it's really your brain that's kind of wired that way.
Yeah.
Talk to us about the dual processing theory, and then we're going to get into some of these cognitive biases.
Yeah. Dual processing theory is pretty cool. So there's a couple of theories out there, but dual processing is the one I like the most. I think it's easy to understand, and it kind of helps explain it really well. So Daniel Kahneman did a lot of research in this in the 70s and presented a theory that's called dual processing. And so the idea behind dual processing is that your brain has kind of two modes. Mode one, or system one, as they call it, is like that's your hot mode. That's your unconscious, fast, associative, like it's your automatic pilot. You can do things in this mode and it takes no energy. System two, though, that's your more logical, deliberate. It's more effortful to use system two, but it's the one that actually helps you think through situations and slow down. It's actually not where the types of biases we're talking about are generally interacting. A lot of the stuff we're talking about happens in system one. So system one relies on these mental shortcuts to create to generate like these intuitive answers to different problems and things like that. And so while system two can kind of debunk those, or has the capability to kind of help you through it. It turns out though, system two does not want to be engaged. System two is the lazy, person in the office in your brain. And really does not want to get engaged. They'll have to, because system one is the easy one. System one, and if our brains are truly trying to take the easy path, it doesn't want to. And the idea behind this is it doesn't want to consume you're trying to conserve energy. And these days, I don't think we need to, because we have restaurants and all kinds of things. We get plenty of energy. Right. But system two really doesn't want to engage. So a lot of times what happens is you have to force it, and you have to create awareness around it to be able to get system two to engage, to be able to debias, to be able to, solve different problems that show up.
Well, I know there's different schools of thought on the number of cognitive biases that typically reside in that system one area. But you focused on 10. So could you just, we don't have time to dive into all 10, but could you just list off the 10 that you're pretty focused on?
Yeah. So overconfidence bias, which is what it sounds like. You're overly confident. Anchoring bias, which is like that contract one we talked about. Confirmation bias, which is a really common one. That's, people seek to find things that agree with you. Blind spot bias, believing that you, don't have any blind spots. Loss aversion bias, which we're going to talk about. Status quo bias is another one. Availability bias. The halo effect, which a lot of people have heard about. That's actually a type of bias. Representativeness bias is another one. And then fundamental attribution error are the 10 that I really like to talk about with people. I find them interesting.
Yeah, as you were going through these in that presentation, it was like, yep, I got that one. Yep, I got that one. So the first one I want to dive into is I'm going to call it FOMO, fear of missing out, right? Loss aversion. Talk to us about that bias.
Yeah. So loss aversion. So I'll use the definition and then we can talk about it. So it's an asymmetric evaluation of positive and negative outcomes in which the negative outcomes are overestimated to be larger. And so like the easy way of saying that is you're very worried then about the negative thing that could happen. So like we see this in like the stock market where people, they buy a stock and then they sell it really early before they've really let it continue to earn, or it loses a little bit and they immediately sell it thinking they're going to lose too much. What happens so to me, this one happens in the office. I get nervous about a project and I reject a project, but the reality is, it could save me 1,000 man hours, but it was going to cost me 100. But I start getting overly worried about that 100. Mm-hmm. The other thing that happens with loss aversion bias that I just find funny is it's when you miss out on something. So like the last piece of cake, if you get it, you're done. If you don't get it, you think about it all day. Like, why didn't I eat that piece of cake? I really wanted that.
I wanted that. Yeah, right. Yeah. I've been telling people. So here in Indianapolis, the Mira Awards were Saturday night, and I decided this year that I wasn't going to go. A lot of different reasons, but then as the photographs started coming on LinkedIn of all these people having such a great time at the event, it was like, oh man, I really missed out on on that. So it was like that piece of cake that I didn't eat. I've been thinking about it all week.
Unfortunately, that's not the end of the world. From an innovation perspective, an office perspective, I used to get this is one I try to watch out for because I feel like from a leadership perspective, this one can this can impact your career if you do have to learn how to take a little bit of risk and how to take on some different initiatives and things like that. And if you and you should absolutely, do risk evaluations and things like that. But if you overestimate the risk of doing something, it'll lead to delays, cancellations, things like that, result in problems for the company.
So what do we do about it? How do we unbias or debias ourselves on this one?
Yeah, this one, the best thing to do is actually, so like pros and cons analysis, assess benefits, do a risk assessment if it's like a project. And truly what you want to do is get another's opinion on what they think. And I think those concepts are really important. And you'll see this a lot. You'll see a lot of like debiasing techniques are like create awareness, which you're doing a great job today having this conversation. Get others' opinions, things like that. Those are the types of things that we can do to debias. But this one specifically, it's go after trying to do a benefits assessment, try to get someone to help you with a risk assessment to really figure out if you've got loss aversion bias going on.
Try to get some quantitative things to look at as you're trying to make that decision.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great one. And I know we're going to talk later about, okay, so how do you interrupt this thing and engage the system too? But we'll talk about that in a minute. The next one I want to talk about is near and dear to my heart. It's called the status quo bias. And the reason it's near and dear to my heart is that's why our podcast is named Status Go. It's for technology leaders who want to break out of the status quo and move their departments and their businesses forward. So what is the status quo bias?
Yeah, this is great. I love that you picked this one. So the status quo bias is it's the resistance to any change, right? So anything that alters current state, we just resist it. And we do this all the time. And what you and I were talking about CIOs and in these executive type technology roles, like this is a lot of our job is to move people through out of status quo bias and help them. And we've all done this, launched new systems, moved platforms, things like that. But like we see this in lots of different areas, but like, why do we keep the same insurance when I think there's a study I read that said every 2 years, you should actually requote your insurance because the chances are you can actually get a better rate with the same, with basically the same policy. But status quo bias, right? We don't want the change. You want to keep things the same. Some people stay in jobs too long. They and it's okay if you love your job. There's nothing wrong with that. But some people will stay in a job too long because not because they want to, but just because of status quo biases. They fear the change, right? Um, what we see this one I find really interesting, and this is something to watch out for. So, what in the sales cycle, what can happen is you'll see add-ons to contracts, and Microsoft I think has done this to me, and they'll add all these things in, and you have to look at the contract. You're like, well, I didn't want any of those. But then now that it's in the contract, it turns out like they've done studies on this, and you're more likely to leave the stuff in the contract and figure out, how to maybe just do a little bit of price negotiation or just leave it in there, which helps them in the long run because you're, consuming different services like that. And it might be a good thing, but it's your brain, once it sees something there, tries to limit the amount of change that's happening.
That's interesting. I never thought about this in context of a contract and contract negotiation where you see it in there, and rather than negotiating it out, you kind of negotiate around it almost.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And it's not like these always happen. These are just the tendencies of our mind to do certain things. And some people I've met, seen really good contract negotiators. They know how to, and this is like when System 1's involved, right? You just like that visualization story, you quickly look at it, all right, and you move on. This would be more, if you can get, like you were talking System 2, or if you can get your System 2 to engage, and you can sit down and really start to engage it, that's where you'll start to be able to kind of debias this type of bias.
And you mentioned this as you were describing this status quo bias, that part of our jobs are to implement change, and everybody just, change is hard, and it's really this bias that's in that, and trying to motivate people or influence people to make the change. You really have to use some of the techniques that you were just talking about to show people kind of what's in it for them, what's the benefit to them. And what you're really trying to do, I think, is have them engage their System 2.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this one, because there's different sides of this, right? If we're the change agent, we're the ones trying to make the change. This one's good to be aware of, that this is what's going on for everyone around you. So how do you help them engage their System 2? And what you'll find is, like, assessing alternatives becomes really important. Giving people options so they feel like they've got some control and can, be part of the decisioning process. There's this concept that comes up when we talk about status quo bias called like cognitive rigidity, which I love. It sounds cool, but it's probably not good. But the idea behind it is, like, people will close off, and your job, and I think our job as technologists and leaders, is to try to help, open that up. And what I think about this one specific, and I love that you picked this one because I think it's so relevant to today, with the digital transformation initiatives that are going on in companies at this point. Like, this is what we're fighting, and what I think what the COVID situations did over the last 2 years is people are, we've got people shifting back into offices. We've got these giant digital transformation initiatives that are going on, and these are huge changes going on for people. And so I think a lot of what we've got to do is try to help people understand different options, try to get people System 2s engaged. But remember, that's a lazy engine, and they'd rather just go with the bias and move on.
Yeah. It's too bad we don't have a switch. We can just reach over and, turn somebody's switch on to say, okay, System 2's engaged now. Let's go.
We could, you and I, we should write something up on that and try to figure out how we get that. I need that.
Yeah, that would be great. All right. The next one I want to jump into is one called the anchoring bias. And I think this is so important in our daily lives because it comes into play in so many different ways. So what is the anchoring bias? And then give us an example or two.
Yeah, this one is real. This one, I had to read about this one a lot because I had to keep reading it to try to understand exactly why was that happening. So the anchoring bias is, like, we use, like, one piece of information that we hear, and that's our anchor. And then we assume we can use that, and then we assume it's correct to make some decision. So someone tells you that you go see a computer costs $5,000, then you see one for $1,000, you immediately think the second one is cheap, where they actually could both have been very, very, and very, very expensive computers for what you were going to get. but you've anchored around that first thing that you saw, $5,000 for a computer.
Yeah.
This happens with cars. I don't have this one
Mhm.
normally in my deck, but car negotiations, you see this when you see a price for a car. The story that we talked about, a contract for $1 million, and then immediately looking at a subscription agreement or something like that for $10,000 a month.
Right.
And your brain has, and this happens a lot with numbers. Our brains do this with numbers. We've anchored back to that number we just saw. And so we'll start to think that's cheap because of the number we just saw, versus if you had been looking at a contract for, $500 and then you saw a $10,000 a month subscription, you'd be like, oh my gosh, that's expensive.
Yeah.
What's going on? So a lot of times this is anchoring effect, or anchoring biases are where you hear people like in salary negotiations.
Yeah. Yeah.
The first person that, everyone says like, don't be the first person to say a number. And that I've read a few things on this, and that actually can be your benefit to sometimes say the number first, and sometimes it's not. But whoever says it first that becomes our anchor, that we're all going to negotiate around that point, right?
Yeah. It'll go plus and minus from that number,
Right.
but it won't go orders of magnitude different.
Right. So it's this one is, for me, is really difficult because I know it's happening. And so there's different techniques I've heard, like this is like, you've got to engage system 2. That's your only way to work through this one. And so a lot of people say like between things that you feel like are having anchoring effects, you should try to take breaks. Actually I had a friend of mine tell me that what they like to do is they actually like to think about like the scores from last night's game or something like that, like between contracts or things like that. They'll look up something on ESPN, before they start on the next thing. And he does a lot of contract negotiation. So, so there's different things that you can do to just kind of unanchor yourself from that if you're working on like a common work stream or something like that. Or the other thing that some people do is ask for multiple forecasts on something. So if someone says, what do you think I should, ask for in salary, or what do you think that this contract should cost? And you get a few different viewpoints, and now you've got all this information that came in, and that you can kind of start to really think it through at that point.
Multiple data points. I find it interesting. The person that you mentioned that goes and looks at sports scores, because that's getting more numbers in your head, and I assume what that does is break that anchor to the original number, so that you're fresh going into looking at the next one.
Yeah, especially if it's like a contract negotiation. He feels that helps him break the anchoring effect, or it kind of makes him like take a deep breath and then go back. And then what happens is he's got to refocus, which it's system 2. He's got to refocus to figure out where he was at and what was happening. So he feels like that kind of starts the system 2 process. Well, that's how I describe it. He describes it differently, but as I'm listening, I'm like, oh, that makes sense.
Well, that's because you've studied it, and maybe he hasn't. So,
Slightly.
No, I think that's a great, just the mental image of system 1 versus system 2. I don't know why, but I keep thinking Star Trek, engage system 2, right? That'll be my new thing. I'll be geeking out
engage
on Star Trek.
System 2. I like that.
Yeah. All right. The last one we have time for today, Mike, the halo effect. What bias is that? And give us some examples, and then let's talk about how do we break that cycle.
Yeah. So the halo effect, a lot of people have heard about this one, but the halo effect, so that shapes our views of the world. So we relate our perspective in one area to influence another that could be completely unrelated. Mm-hmm. So an example would be like so in that visualization, so thinking someone's good at their job because you have similar outside work. So you both like golf. So obviously they must be a great computer engineer or whatever.
Right.
Sometimes people, this one I find really interesting. So a lot of times people think extroverts are more intelligent because they talk more and they're more outgoing. And so they're like, oh, well, they must be more intelligent because they're willing to talk. And it's like, no, that's potentially has no bearing on that at all. And this has happened to me. This one was interesting. So you assume a person who's wearing a suit is in charge, because I work in banking, and most of the people that I know wear suits a lot. Yeah. And so I see people in suits and people wearing t-shirts, and I assume the people in the suits are in charge. And we had a CTO from a software company that had come in with a big team because we had a problem going on. And he showed up. This team showed up. I didn't know what he looked like. This is before LinkedIn and I could look at someone's picture before they came in the building.
Yeah.
And so he shows up, this whole team, 10 people, and they're introducing everyone. Everyone's standing around. And we immediately went up to there were 3 of them, a couple of them in suits. Went up to them because we figured this is the executive team that's here. Talked to them for a little while, and they said, "Oh, this is the CTO, Miguel." And we look at Miguel, and Miguel is in t-shirt, jeans that I probably hadn't been washed in a few weeks. By far one of the most brilliant people I've ever talked to in my life, but had no interest in suits. You couldn't have convinced him to wear one for anything. But those are the types of halo effects.
My kind of guy. I love that. I love that.
Right?
So how do we break the halo effect?
So this one's hard. This is really, really hard because of how we're wired. But so again, it's a lot of system 2 engagement. One thing you can do if you have to make a decision between people and you're worried about the halo effect involving maybe 2 people in a promotion or something like that. You can try to remove personally identified information from the decision. Use quantitative information, getting other people involved then in the decision, show them your data and say, here's what I'm thinking of doing. Give me a perspective. Those are the types of things that we can do. And ultimately, this one is a lot about awareness and just knowing that this is an effect that occurs. And this doesn't mean you should immediately go out and say, I'm going to make sure all these people that I like hanging out with and talking to it, where I don't like them anymore. You shouldn't do that. Yeah. But you should, but engage and kind of think about it. But yeah, removing personally identifiable information when you're making decisions, trying to, engage system 2, things like that. As you go through the day. And the easiest way to engage system 2 is actually to kind of take a deep breath when you're thinking about something. You'll probably still make the mistake every once in a while walking to the people up in suits. I don't know if you can stop that one.
That one's probably tough.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, we have covered a lot of space here, a lot of territory, and we're running up on time. So, as you know, as I mentioned, status quo, we're trying to break out and become status go. So what are 1 or 2 things that our listeners should do tomorrow because they listened to us today?
Yeah. So I'd advise 2 things. So one, when you're making decisions, big decisions, take a deep breath and think about that system 2 concept. And you'll find just doing that actually helps you engage your system 2. And I think in doing that, you're kind of forcing your brain to not be so lazy, and you'll find that your decision-making ability should become better. The second thing that I would really, so listening to this podcast it's not one it's definitely one I would recommend. This is, talking to you and I is great, but so after listening to this, hopefully one of the things you heard is like getting opposing viewpoints becomes really important. So you've done the thing by listening to the podcast, you've created awareness. That's actually a giant one. But getting opposing viewpoints and actually listening to people you don't agree with could be really hard, because maybe like from a halo effect, you're like, I want to promote this person. They're great. We play golf every Saturday. Versus, trying to pull out some data and say, well, yeah, but I had these 2 people and this other one actually, from a performance perspective, they actually perform a lot better. Maybe we should get a different opinion. So seek other opinions. Don't fight. Just try to, go through the environment and try to, get perspectives that might not confirm your own, and then weigh the options. So
I love that. The take a deep breath to take that pause and think, is this a decision where I need to engage system 2? Even that thought process, because we don't need to do that deep thinking on every decision that we're making. But if it's important enough, take that pause and just think, and then get opposing viewpoints. I think that plays into a lot of areas of our life that we won't get into right now. But having different viewpoints and that diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, I think is important for us as leaders. So
absolutely.
Great recommendations, Mike. Mike, this has been a lot of fun. And before we close out, I want to mention your blog. I stumbled on it the other day. I didn't know you had it out there. It's called The Data Hitchhiker. Tell us just a little bit about that, and then we'll be sure in our show notes to include a link to that so people can check that out.
Yeah, I just spun that up. Actually, you want to know I set that up because I was actually researching different types of patterns for social media and things like that. But then I found that I actually enjoyed writing some of the articles. And the idea behind it was I was going to collect stories or information that would help people that were on some kind of data journey. It doesn't matter if you're building a BI program or you're a BI analyst or you're trying to make a decision around data platforms or you're just curious about a story. I actually have posted some of this material in there that talks about, how biases affect data. I think there's 2 articles in there about it. But the idea behind it was just to help people with data journeys with anything that I could share. So it's pretty fun, actually.
Oh, that's awesome. And I've read a couple of the pieces that you have out there. And to our audiences, I think you'll gain some real insights as you read some of those posts and follow along with Mike on his journey digging into data. So, Mike, thank you. Oh my gosh, it's been so great. I am so glad that we kind of ran into each other at that event a month or so ago, because I think this topic is so important. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I've appreciated it.
To our listeners, if you have a question or want to learn more, visit intervision.com. The show notes will provide links and contact information. This is Jeff Tunn for Mike Butler. Thank you very much for listening.
You've been listening to the Status Go podcast. You can subscribe on iTunes or get more information at intervision.com. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, find Intervision on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Thank you for listening. Until next time.